A humble waitress helped a billionaire until she found out whose locket was hanging around his neck. The Arizona heat was scorching everything alive when the Lucid Air luxury electric car hissed to a halt on the side of the road somewhere between the desert hills near Sedona. The sand was melting like liquid gold under the sun, and the hot wind was hitting the windshield as hard as if it wanted to push the car back onto the highway. Ethan Warner took off his sunglasses and cursed through his teeth. His palms were sweating, not from the heat but from powerlessness. He got out, slammed the door and walked around the car, examining it as if he could fix the electrical system with a look. The stylish, impeccably tailored linen suit was dark with sweat at the back and collar, and the expensive shoes were stuck in the hot sand. The world he'd spent so long building was crumbling, not with a crash but with the hiss of overheated batteries. 22 years ago he was a rising star in Silicon Valley. Today he's the owner of a huge Warner Tech corporation, saddled with lawsuits, board betrayal and rumors in business publications about his unstable mental state. All of this, after one article, one bad interview, and one scandal he didn't get involved in. And now, the car is stranded in the middle of the desert. No communication, no internet, no chance to explain himself. He barely had time to open the trunk before an old silver Toyota showed up off the dusty roadway, drove closer and pulled up beside him. A girl in a baseball cap and faded jeans jumped out, wiped her palms on her shirt and headed confidently toward him. He tensed. Over the years, he'd learned to be wary of sudden kindness. But she didn't look dangerous. More like someone who could change the oil in a tractor or fix the coffee machine at the diner in no time. Battery trouble? She asked simply, not even waiting for an invitation, and was already leaning toward the front compartment. Ethan was about to wave her off, but something in her voice, absolute confidence, a complete lack of fear, made him back off. He opened the hood. She peered inside and touched something there with her finger. No caution, no hesitation. Just business. When she lifted her head, a short chain slipped from under her collar and hung in the air, glinting silver in the sunlight. Ethan felt something freeze in his chest. A locket. Small, oval, with a finely engraved silhouette of a hummingbird on the surface. The exact same one he'd ordered from a jeweler 22 years ago, when he'd placed it in the hand of his wife, Anna, at dawn after their wedding. He had even made sure then that the engraving on the inside was hidden behind a microscopic lock. The hummingbird is a symbol of freedom, of lightness, of memory. And her disappearance had shattered all that. The girl noticed his gaze and covered the locket with the palm of her hand automatically. Is something wrong? She asked, unaware of how her innocent gesture had planted a red-hot rock in his stomach. The locket? He squeezed out, barely containing the tremor in his voice. She frowned slightly. All that magnetizes sometimes. I think there's some old mechanism in there or something. I don't part with it. My mom left it. You know, the one who left me at the orphanage. She said it somehow calmly, without self-pity, as if she'd long ago reconciled. The orphanage? Ethan took a step closer. In Boulder. Called Willow Ridge, if I remember correctly. That's where they found me. All I had on me was this locket and a blanket with my initials, but they've been erased over time. The bird, on the other hand, remains. She grinned and busied herself with the hood again. Gracie, my grandmother, says it's fate in silver. But she avoids talking about my mom herself. Always avoiding the subject. Only once she said she knew her. Or maybe knew someone who did. Ethan felt everything inside clench. He only had two things he'd kept in the safe all these years. One ultrasound scan and an empty locket box, an exact replica of which was now gleaming around this girl's neck. Inside that box was a tiny document, an engraving order made out to Anna Grace Warner. But he was silent. His brain was working feverishly. He couldn't let himself believe it. Not now. Not on the side of a deserted road where reality seemed a mirage. The girl straightened up, wiped her hands on her jeans. The contact fell off. Happens with these new models. Try starting it now. He got in the car, pressed a button. The Lucid Air hummed, coming to life. He got out and looked at her. What's your name? He asked, already knowing that the name was just the beginning. Leela. Leela Monroe, she replied. And walked off to her old Toyota, leaving him standing in the middle of the desert with shaking hands and a sinking heart. Colibri. Boulder. Shelter. Gracie. It all fit. But was she? No. Too soon. Too unbelievable. But if she was? The sky over San Francisco was overcast, like everything in Ethan's life in recent months. He'd taken the first flight after the meeting in Arizona, not saying a word to the driver and barely letting go of his phone. The car drove smoothly up Twin Peaks, And the same picture kept running through his mind, the locket around Leela's neck. He'd held one of those in his hands 22 years ago. He'd picked out that hummingbird himself. Watched as the jeweler inserted the tiny plate into the wing that Ethan had insisted on, even though Anna had laughed. What for? It's not a flash drive. All he'd said then was, maybe someday she'll be the one to explain everything. The study in his house on the hill was cold, as if frozen from the very time he'd learned of the crash. He took a box out of the safe. The same one, velvet, embossed with the logo of a workshop that had long since ceased to exist. Empty. The locket was with her. Anna. Or, with their baby? Ethan turned on an old laptop, one he hadn't used in nearly 2 decades. The hard drive hummed as if awakening from a coma. He began opening folders one by one. Reports, newspapers, official documents about the crash. A complete archive of everything he'd collected back then. He had a habit of not trusting investigators, especially in matters where his heart told him something was wrong. Back then he'd almost driven himself crazy leafing through the reports. Today he read with clear fear. In one of the folders he came across a clipping from a little-known newspaper in Colorado. Headline, Woman with no name found in mountains near Breaking Creek. The date matched exactly 4 days after the alleged crash date. Only a few lines in the note. Firefighters extinguishing a fire on a hillside found the woman unconscious. Undocumented, with severe head trauma. She was taken to a clinic on the south side of Boulder. The name is Everpine Health. Ethan opened his bank records. Nothing unusual at first. Then transactions, small but regular, starting in August 2002. Money was leaving one of the company's reserve funds in the name of S. Warner Medical Trust. He didn't remember setting one up. The amounts had grown over the years. The last one was just 2 weeks ago. He fumbled for the phone, barely hitting the buttons. A private investigator picked up, Harrison Tate, a man Ethan trusted more than he trusted himself. He briefly explained the task. Find out everything you can about a girl named Leela Monroe, Sedona. Works at a diner, wearing a silver hummingbird locket around her neck. I need DNA. Fast. And without her knowing. He didn't sleep that night. Went into the living room at dawn, trying to distract himself with coffee and a view of the bay, when the door suddenly swung open. Miles. A cousin, heir to those sides of the Warners who'd always favored surfing over business and freedom over stockholders' meetings. Tanned, wearing jeans like he'd just come from the coast. You won't believe who I met in Arizona, he said from the doorway. Ethan turned, already knowing the answer. Her name's Leela. Works at the diner. Awesome. A mechanic at heart, a poet at heart. And she has. He pulled a picture out of his pocket on his phone. Leela in a baseball cap with a medallion in the sun. She has this weird pendant like a bird, a hummingbird I think? Ethan didn't answer right away. He was looking at the photo as if for the first time. As if he was looking not at the girl but at the past. Miles sat down next to him, not noticing the change in his face. I'm calling her for her father's appointment. I want you to talk to her. You always said it's important to feel the moment. And I can feel it, it's something real. Ethan nodded. Real, yes. Just not for you, Miles. For me. Later he sat down at his laptop again. Read the article about the woman from Breaking Creek all the way through. She disappeared from the hospital 5 days later. No trace. All it says is transferred to a specialized facility at the request of a private caregiver. No name. Signed, transfer agreed through a representative of the S. Warner Medical Trust. It was his trust. His signature was at the bottom of the agreement. Only he never signed it. Ever. Or maybe his hand did, but not his will. Times were tough. Then he confided in Charles Denton. He said he'd fix it. Save the business. He'd help him through it. He may have signed more than he needed to. And he had given the keys not only to the company but to his whole life. Now it was up to Charles to figure out exactly what Charles had hidden behind his back. And if Leela really was who Ethan was beginning to believe she was, then his whole life was built on a lie. He stared at the photo. The girl with the locket. His possible daughter. On Miles' lap. His nephew. Ethan realized he couldn't wait any longer. In a private clinic on the outskirts of Boulder, where the fates of those who were to disappear were hidden behind glass facades, Dr. Carter Hall closed the door behind him with a clearance-only sign and exhaled slowly. He knew if his father, the chief medical officer of this facility, saw him looking through the locked files, he would be suspended immediately. Or worse. But Carter wasn't acting as a doctor, he was acting as an agent. Or rather, a double agent. For the second year he was working with the Federal Bureau of Medical Malpractice, trying to uncover a network of anonymous transfers involving the funding of personalized comatose patients. Patients that no one ever visited but were paid for very generously. AG 21. A woman kept under that code in room 1. Medical records are minimal. Age about 45, physical parameters, signs of years of lying down, extensive medication. No name, no past. But in the signature on the original admission glimpsed, admitted under the care of S. Warner Medical Trust. Carter remembered that name. His father had said it only once, with that peculiar intonation when a man speaks of someone important but unwanted. Warner. Carter had written it all down then. Now he was standing at AG 21's bedside. The woman lay almost motionless, but the eyes under her eyelids were fluttering. He checked the monitor. Brain activity was abnormally high for someone who was considered a hopeless patient. He lowered the drip just a little, just on the edge of tolerance. Even yesterday he'd noticed the reaction when he turned on the radio in the room, the muscles in his face twitching. Today he risked saying it out loud, "Anna?" And in that moment something changed. Her fingers, previously motionless, moved. What? Then again. Carter snapped a picture of the EEG screen and quickly sent the report over the encrypted channel. If she's waking up, that means she can talk. Which means she can tell why a foundation with the name Warner paid for her comatose existence for decades. And perhaps, who she is. That same day in Sedona, in a small house tucked into dusty alleys amid cacti and cinnamon scents, Gracie put on the kettle and turned on the television to drown out her thoughts. The news in the background was about an internal conflict on the board of directors of a certain technology corporation. But a name on the screen made her cup freeze in midair. Charles Denton. A picture, a few seconds, and that was it. But it was enough. A face she hadn't seen in 20 years, but hadn't forgotten. The same man who'd shown up at the clinic just before the baby had fallen into her hands, wrapped in a thin blanket with an embroidered bird and a locket dangling from a thin chain. Then he introduced himself as a patron of the charity program, spoke slowly with a lulling voice. But his eyes were cold. And the woman who'd brought the infant was silent, with a bandage around her throat. Gracie thought then, her throat was damaged. She couldn't speak, just held the baby tightly as if afraid to give it away. And then she was gone. Gracie wanted to report it, but the orphanage told her to keep it simple. So she stayed quiet. Thought she was doing the right thing. Now she doubted it. Meanwhile, Leela rummaged through old boxes, looking for pictures for her college project. There, among the yellowed photos, a thick envelope slipped out. No stamp, no address. On it was a drawing, a hummingbird, hand-drawn in thin lines with reverent precision. Inside a letter. A few phrases, it's not clear to whom. The handwriting is smooth, feminine. I cannot speak, but I can see her eyes and they remind me of him. If anyone ever finds this, tell her that she was born out of love. And that the bird will point the way. Signed Anna. Nothing else. Leela didn't understand how that envelope had ended up among her childhood belongings. She didn't remember seeing it before. She held the paper up to the light and noticed that the hummingbird pattern was not only inked, but micro-textured. It felt like a metallic outline. She reached for her locket, took it off and looked closely. The engraving was exactly the same. It was a hummingbird, with wings spread and more than a pattern in the curve of its wings. Sometimes, especially in the silence, the locket hummed quietly. She thought it was a peculiarity of the metal or a magnet. But now she wondered, could it be hiding something? That night, Carter Hall opened the medallion's photo from his report, the one they'd found at AG 21 on the day of admission, but later removed from the database on orders. The hummingbird was identical to the one he'd seen in Sedona, around the neck of a girl taken by a surveillance camera outside a roadside diner. He realized, the locket wasn't just jewelry. There's something in it. And it might be the key to something his father, Denton, and someone else above him had been hiding for decades. The morning fog had barely cleared over Boulder when a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to a small one-story house on the outskirts. Charles Denton sat behind the wheel. His face remained calm, but tension slid into the depths of his eyes. He got out of the car, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive jacket, and pulled from the trunk a folder with the logo of a fictitious charity. The name tag read, Livingston Education Initiative. Fiction as much as anything else. Gracie didn't open the door right away. Her hands were shaking. She recognized him the second he walked up the porch. More than 20 years had passed, but the expression on his face was still the same, politely cold, lifeless. She tried to smile, but the corners of her lips wouldn't obey. Leela, as luck would have it, was home alone. She was on her way to take a shower when she heard a conversation in the hallway. She looked out into the hallway, tied a towel over her head, and approached cautiously. Charles introduced himself as a representative of a foundation that sought talented youth from disadvantaged backgrounds to provide scholarships and support. He spoke confidently with courteous turns of phrase and emphasized empathy. Leela listened politely, but something in his voice seemed fake to her. It was especially alarming when he mentioned the locket. He said he'd seen her picture and that the jewelry resembled a piece from the family collection. Gracie clenched her fingers on the cup. She didn't know if Ethan would arrive on time. She didn't know how much Charles would guess. But she did know one thing for sure: if Leela was alone with him, he might steal her away. Or worse. She interrupted the conversation and asked Leela to bring an old album from her room, ostensibly to show her the photos for the questionnaire. When she left, Gracie said quietly, "You have no right to go near her. You already took her mother once." Charles bowed his head as if puzzled. But his eyes darkened. "You forget, madam, who has ensured your silence for 20 years. Gracie straightened, and for the first time in years her voice sounded firm. "It wasn't a deal. It was intimidation. But I'm not afraid anymore." At this time at the clinic, Carter Hall was finalizing the last preparations. Changing guards, fictitious journal entries, disabling one of the cameras. It all had to look like an accident. AG-21's patient, Anna, began answering questions. Slowly but surely. She remembered not only Ethan's face, but the date of her last trip, the plane crash, the birth, and most importantly, the man who stood at her bedside and lied that her husband was dead. She recognized Charles. And said his name. Carter recorded everything on a tape recorder hidden in a medical reference book on his desk. He knew it would carry more weight than any document. At one point, Anna grabbed his arm, her gaze becoming desperate. "The hummingbird, Leela has it. It's got everything they need inside. I hid it for them." He didn't immediately realize what she was talking about. She described the thin plate embedded under the top flap of the pendant. There, it turned out, was a tiny flash drive of data, bank transfers, encrypted correspondence, screenshots of documents she'd managed to collect before the accident. Everything that was supposed to be her defense. Anything that could bring down the Denon Empire. Meanwhile, back home in Boulder, Leela was leafing through a scrapbook and came across that very same hummingbird envelope. Inside, a small gray chip, the size of a fingernail, slipped casually between the pages. It looked familiar to her. She remembered finding it in a locket as a child, but she'd been afraid she'd broken a piece of jewelry, so she'd hidden it in her scrapbook. Looking at it now, she felt that this chip was more than just a memory. It was an answer. Returning to the living room, she no longer hid her wariness. Charles stood up when he saw the scrapbook in her hands. Gracie tried to get between them. At that moment, footsteps were heard on the porch. The door swung open and Ethan appeared in the house. Without a word, he met Charles's gaze. The silence lasted a few seconds. Then Ethan shifted his gaze to Leela. He noticed the gray capsule in her hands. And he realized that it was the very protection Anna had spoken of, the spark that would begin the end of the lie. Charles realized it too. He took a step forward, but Ethan had already stepped between him and Leela. The boiling point was near. Everything that had been lurking in the shadows for 2 decades had come out. Gracie whispered, "He took your mother. And he was going to take you." Leela looked at her with the same expression that Anna had once looked at the baby in the silent woman's arms. And now she knew. The house in Boulder, surrounded by the scents of pine and the light breath of the mountains, witnessed the final awakening of memory. For people were gathered in one living room: Ethan Warner with a haggard but enlightened gaze, Anna still frail but standing unsupported, Carter Hall, who no longer hid his affiliation with the Bureau, and Leela, a girl with eyes that reflected pain, clarity, and the beginning of something new. There was only air between them, tense, saturated with the unspoken, but no longer heavy. They looked at each other like ships that had survived a storm, steaming out onto level water for the first time. Anna could hardly keep herself under control. Her fingers trembled as she reached up to touch Leela's cheek. She hadn't yet spoken aloud who was in front of her, but her eyes spoke louder than words. Carter spread out the contents of the microchip on the laptop. Among the bank entries, closed accounts, and encrypted correspondence was something else, a file labeled "Last." It turned out to be a video. A blurry picture. Inside the cabin of a private jet, turbines could be heard rumbling from behind. Anna, then younger, with tears on her face and a medallion in her hand, spoke into the camera. Her voice was steady but filled with anxiety. She talked about leaving the country because she knew of collusion between Charles and several board members. She talked about forged documents, reissued assets, plans to eliminate Not only her but also her young daughter if Ethan didn't comply. The last sentence was like a knife. If this video is found, I'm no longer with them. But please find our daughter. She'll have the hummingbird locket. I put everything I could in it. Anything that can save her. The next day, FBI agents arrested Charles Denton Wright on the runway of a private airfield in Denver. His face didn't flinch for a second. He remained silent as the handcuffs were snapped on his wrists. When he was presented with the video and bank evidence, he only turned his back to the sun and said, "Too bad you were quicker." He hadn't believed to the last that his own surveillance and control system had failed. But it had. He didn't just want Anna gone. He wanted to erase the Warners' very name from business history, turning the empire into a personal feeding trough for his children, whom he'd raised in luxury but without the truth. A month later, in Colorado's San Luis Valley, against a backdrop of sunset and a dusty pink horizon, the Warner Hope Family Foundation held a restorative meeting. Leela took the stage in a stern but light-colored suit. Her hair was swept back, her gaze collected. Standing next to her were Anna and Ethan. Their presence was a sensation in itself. To many, they were long dead or forgotten. This evening they didn't talk business, they didn't mention affairs. They talked about the truth. About time stolen by lies. About lost years that were now coming back, not as a debt but as a chance. Leela had officially taken on a new role, executive director of the Foundation for Social Support. At the banquet after the meeting she said succinctly, "I was a waitress at a roadside diner. And that was the best school of humanity. I won't give up the past because that's what brought me home." Gracie, seated in the front row, wiped her eyes. Carter sat next to her, no longer in his robe but in his regular shirt. He knew things would start to change now. And he knew he'd stay by his side if they'd let him. 6 months later, a new support center for women survivors of abuse, abduction, or bereavement opened in Boulder. A sign shone on the facade, Colibri Help Center. Beneath it was an engraved phrase, "In flight is the power of memory." On the wall inside hung a portrait of a woman with soft eyes and a familiar medallion on her chest. Not as an icon but as a sign, memory is alive. And it could no longer be hidden. Leela opened the doors herself. She met women, teenagers, old and young, and in each she found a look in which she had once recognized herself. She was no longer afraid. She no longer searched. Because everything she needed to know was already in her blood, in her voice, in the wings of the very bird that had buzzed over her heart and had once changed everything. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.